Welcome. Hello. Hello. Welcome to the Providence College, the ultimate Providence College Humanities Forum. Ultimate not in the sense of Humanities Forum greater than which nothing can be thought, although it might be that, but definitely ultimate in the sense of the last one. This is the last one until January of next year, when we hope to see your smiling faces again, feeling extra bright and new year-y. All right. As always, let me begin by running through a few expectations, what you can expect and what we expect of you. So the first is, just like when you're on an airplane, we ask you to close all large electronics and stow them for the duration of the flight, et cetera, et cetera. Put your screens away, in other words, so that you can be present to people in the room, because unlike on an airplane, when you reach cruising altitude, you will still be asked to pay attention to the people in the room. Thank you for that. And as you're paying attention, start to formulate in your head a question that you might have, something that you hear that you want to hear more about, something that wasn't touched on that you think should be touched on, something that caught your interest you want to know more about. Because if you've been to any of these before, you know that the first question in the Q&A period goes to a student. And the second and third one will too, as long as you keep on raising your hands. So that Q&A period will wrap up around 4:45, so you know what to expect. And at which point, we're all going to head down the hall to the Fiondella Great Room and taste of the abundance of Providence College and the hors d'oeuvres that await us there. Now, piloting today's Humanities Forum is a doctor named Matthew Rose, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Berry Center on the University and Intellectual Life at the Morningside Institute in New York City. So basically, he works with graduate and postgraduate students from Columbia, from Fordham, from one of these other places, to do research, to get placed in interesting places, to do topics on interesting things. Dr. Rose is a scholar of religion and was previously executive director of the Berkeley Institute and a fellow in the Humanities at Villanova University, where he taught philosophy, politics, and literature. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Chicago and his M.A. from Notre Dame. And he's the author of numerous articles appearing in numerous very fine publications. And most recently wrote a book entitled A World After Liberalism, which came out with Yale University Press in 2021, and which informs his remarks that we're going to hear today. So please give a warm friar welcome to Dr. Matthew Rose.
Thank you for that. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. I'm going to be talking about something kind of weighty and a little bit heavy, but I want to begin by just expressing my enormous gratitude to the community of Providence College for extending the warm welcome that they've given to me. I began on this kind of intellectual project that I'm going to be talking about tonight a couple years ago, and I've declined virtually every opportunity to speak about it. Just because the reasons are both complicated and not complicated, but it's something that I didn't want to invest too much of my life and career talking about a topic for reasons that you're going to hear a lot about tonight. But an invitation for the Dominicans is something very, very special. And I was especially delighted to accept an opportunity from Providence College because of the role of the Dominican order and the role the Dominicans have played in my own life. All of you maybe take it for granted a little bit that studying and being around Dominicans at a college is something normal to you, but Dominicans have played an extraordinary role in my life. My family, we worship at the Dominican parish in Westchester County in New York. My wife studied at the Dominican School for Philosophy and Theology in Oakland, California, and for many years we were parishioners at St. Albert's Priory in Oakland, California, which is to say my own spiritual itinerary and chronology are all punctuated with stops with Dominicans. I've never been to Providence College before, and so now I've kind of done the entire Dominican junket from coast to coast, and I'm really delighted to be here tonight. So thank you for that. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the disturbing death of the French writer Dominique Venner. On May 21st, 2013, Venner took his own life while standing at the main altar of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Venner was 78 years old, and he left a note on the altar to explain what he called his gesture. which took place before nearly 1,000 church visitors. After declaring his soundness of mind and expressing his regret to his wife and 5 children, Venner wrote that he offered his life as a sacrificial protest to awaken Europeans to a civilizational crisis. And I quote, "I love life, and I expect nothing beyond other than the perpetuation of my race and mind. However, in the evening of this life, in front of huge dangers for my French and European country, I feel the duty to act so long as I have strength. I sacrifice myself to break the lethargy that's overtaken us. I offer my life as a protest. While so many people are slaves of their lives, my gesture embodies an ethical will. I give death to myself in order to awaken slumbering consciences. I protest against the poisons that are destroying our identity and the foundation of our civilization." End quote. Venner's writing in the weeks before his suicide left little doubt as to the nature of his concerns. In early May, France had been convulsed by protests over the legalization of same-sex marriage and debates over growing numbers of immigrants from the Maghreb and sub-Saharan Africa. For Venner, new conceptions of marriage and citizenship were alarming signs that the country had reached a state of cultural emergency. Already uncertain about its national identity and ashamed of its colonial past, France seemed, in Venner's mind, to be welcoming its own extinction. He explained, "There exists no historical example of a civilization pushing to this point a refusal to survive and a desire to eliminate itself." Although several media reports described him as a conservative and a Roman Catholic, Venner was in fact neither. A revolutionary and a pagan, Venner was an influential figure in an intellectual movement that has sought to recover human values suppressed by 2 centuries of liberalism and 2 millennia of Christianity. The son of a Vichy collaborator, he had been active in national movements as a young man. In the early 1960s, he served a prison sentence for his involvement in the OAS, a paramilitary organization that sought to defend French Algeria. During his time in prison, Venner had studied the writings of Lenin, whom he grew to admire for extracting a powerful political doctrine out of the writings of Karl Marx. But Venner concluded that the Cold War conflict between liberalism and communism was deceptive, masking problems that couldn't be addressed by political activism. The crisis of the West, he resolved, could be addressed only by a fundamental rethinking of the nature of European identity. In the 5 decades following his release, Venner turned to writing books, authoring books that combined a widely admired prose style with an impressive knowledge of Western literature, philosophy, and art. When his death was covered in the New Yorker magazine, the story was authored by the magazine's longtime poetry critic. Venner ended his suicide note by indicating that in his recent books, one could find a clear foreshadowing of his final action and a fuller statement of the ideals that inspired it. In a book published in 2011, he had reflected at length on what he called the tradition of voluntary death. He lamented the degrading influence of a morality that valued bodily life and comfort as the highest goods. And he extolled the suicides of historical figures, such as the Roman aristocrat Cato, for upholding the ideal that it's better to end one's life than to compromise with decadence or dishonor. Venner's voice from beyond the grave attempted to explain the difference between his death and the suicide of France. If France was poisoning itself through degenerate values, his suicide bore witness to the noble and heroic values that France had rejected. And to understand them, he wrote, one must understand the vision of life to which his action offered such shocking testimony. And what is that vision? In a recent book, I've called it the radical right, an intellectual movement whose way of seeing the world and interpreting human history I'll try to describe for you this afternoon. It's a tradition that offers a challenging perspective on the most pressing issues of our time. Across the West, we are watching a crisis unfold that Dominic Venner and thinkers like him anticipated. We watch as Western nations slide into political dysfunction and social decay. We witness falling life expectancies, declining rates of marriage and religious practice, a swelling pandemic of loneliness, mass confusion around the nature and ideals of manhood, and signs of a new multipolar global order. We see an erosion of trust in institutions and a weakening of belief in the ideals that animated them. And amid all this, we feel the tremors of a political and spiritual revolution. We read eulogies for Christianity and hear of the birth of a post-Christian right. To understand our cultural moment, I think we need to look beyond the public figures who compete for our attention and loyalty. We will also need to expand the range of political possibilities and broaden the historical horizons that mark the boundary of our intellectual life. We'll be helped, I think, if we're able to perceive the diverse religious ideas that animate our culture, even when they wear a secular disguise. In doing this, I'm convinced that we have important things to learn from a body of controversial ideas to which Dominic Venner gave voice. I say this not to valorize his action or to grant him the posthumous benediction that he clearly wished for. Venner's suicide, I hope to show, reveals the self-destructive nature of his vision of identity politics. But the ideals that shaped his mind, and which stir the passions of many, also repay serious study. They can help us to see and repair the defects in the political traditions that we dearly value, and they can help us to understand and renew the Christian tradition to which they're opposed. The radical right emerged in the decade before the Second World War and came to define itself in opposition to the political consensus that characterized post-war Western democracies. Its leading thinkers came from Germany, Italy, France, and the United States, and together they told a story about the 20th century, a story that turned a dominant historical narrative on its head. The dominant narrative saw the peace and prosperity of Western nations as a sign of their fundamental political health. It saw the victory of democracy in the war as proof that the deepest questions about democracy's legitimacy had been decisively answered. It saw the global influence of Western values and habits as evidence of its civilizational prestige. And it saw in the history of the West, as one of progressive development towards its present political form. The story of the West began with Plato and triumphed in NATO, or so the narrative went. At the heart of the story was a belief in the unique legitimacy of liberal democracy. To its defenders, liberal democracy was a form of political life that reflected the values shared by all reasonable persons. It regarded human beings as free and equal by nature. It saw legitimate authority as resting on the consent of the governed. It understood the chief purpose of government to be the protection of individual rights under the rule of law. And it believed in the separation of politics from divisive religious questions. If these ideas formed the basis of a political consensus, they didn't, of course, eliminate civil disagreement. In this country, we engaged in sharp debates over civil rights, foreign policy, and much else. But the intensity of those disputes only demonstrated, I think, the strength of the underlying consensus. The political left and right disagreed about how to protect freedom, how to promote equality, but they didn't disagree about their supreme importance. For most people in the post-war era, it was easier to imagine the end of the world than it was to imagine the end of liberalism. The radical right, however, told a starkly different story and imagined a very different future. It saw the West's preoccupation with material wealth and economic growth as a sign of its moral decadence and spiritual poverty. It saw liberal democracy not as the antipode of communism, but as an ideology that restricted thought, uprooted culture, and leveled social differences no less effectively than Marxism. It saw the West's openness to immigration and multiculturalism as evidence of deep insecurity about its own identity. And it saw in the history of the West a proverbial tale of moral decline, in which the virile virtues needed to sustain a civilization were slowly corrupted by luxury and complacency. For the radical right, then, it wasn't impossible to imagine a world after liberalism. It was necessary. The thinkers who told this story occupy a unique place in our intellectual life. When they're not simply dismissed out of hand, their ideas are alleged to be not only objectionable, but dangerous, both fundamentally alien to our core values, but also insidiously threatening to them. A common view, therefore, holds that their books and arguments give voice to prejudices that should be severely marginalized, rather than to human possibilities that should be critically examined. If this approach was prudent in an earlier time, I believe it no longer is. Today, it works not to protect those things that we should value the most, but to leave them imperiled to the corrosive effects of ignorance and hubris. So, let us now look at some of the key ideas that thinkers like Dominic Venner regarded as essential to the past and to the future of our culture. Ideas about cultural differences, human inequality, violence, and finally, the nature of Christianity. In a 2005 book, Dominic Venner argued that the most dangerous enemy confronting the West was not political or military in nature. It was the danger of amnesia. Western peoples had forgotten who they are and who they once were. As Venner imagined it, the world is teeming with people who are certain of their group identities, proud of their distinctiveness, and zealous to defend and transmit their own traditions. The nations of the West, however, are an exception. Not only are they estranged from a past that they can scarcely remember, they are demoralized to an almost pathological degree. They celebrate other cultures as superior to their own. They judge their history by standards they apply to no others. And they allow their own values to be wielded cynically against them. As Venner wrote, it was as if Western nations had a bias against themselves, preferring other communities above their own. Venner therefore undertook to remind Europeans of the source of their lost identity. He began by noting that Europeans are no different from other peoples. They have an identity that is unique to them, an identity that subtly but unmistakably imprints itself on every aspect of their life. For Venner, this identity couldn't be discovered in human DNA, or indeed in anything biological at all. Identity is revealed in culture, in that sphere of activity by which human beings struggled to raise themselves above the pressures of animal life. Identity is what inspires and shapes everything that a culture does. It's the soul of its art, language, music, architecture, religion, politics, games, cuisine, folkways, everything. Cultural forms and styles change over time, Venner argued, but their inner spirit always remains one and the same. From the cave paintings of prehistoric Europe to the poems of Homer, from Roman philosophers to the literature of medieval chivalry, from Renaissance visions of empire up until today, Venner found a single spiritual thread, almost a kind of cultural bloodline, linking Western culture across a span of 30,000 years. His argument borrowed from a major figure in the radical right, the Italian philosopher Julius Evola. Evola claimed to have discovered the permanent principles of all human societies by peering back into human prehistory, back before the rise of writing and critical rationality. Inspired by Evola's speculative histories, Venner claimed to have discovered the primal origin of Western culture. He called it tradition, a term he described in almost theological terms. Tradition is the invisible wellspring of Western culture, the generative source and ground of all it does and is. Tradition is that in which Europeans live and move and have their being. It's the deepest metaphysical core of their identity, providing the permanent truths that find expression in Western art, thought, and life. As Venner explained it, tradition can't be identified with any one artifact or epoch. It was more like a kind of collective soul that disposes Western people to experiencing reality in a unique way. Sight, sensation, speech, imagination, desire, reasoning. For Venner, every human faculty is inwardly shaped by tradition. As a vision of human identity, Venner's was profoundly illiberal. At our deepest core, we are custodians, not creators. We are inheritors, not choosers. And our cultures are fundamentally different, not alike. We exist not only through relationships we haven't chosen and under obligations we can't renounce. We exist as bearers of a collective identity that connects us indissolubly to those who are like us and separates us forever from those who are different. Europeans can, of course, respect other cultures, and Venner wrote of his own admiration for Japanese tradition. But in no civilization, Venner argued, can cultural insiders truly share a common life with cultural outsiders. And it's foolish, or worse, to attempt to confect a multicultural society. Tradition can nonetheless be forgotten, and it can be betrayed, and the consequences are shattering for human identity. Venner attributed the chaos of modern culture to the illusion that human identity can be discovered only by being freed from the impositions of the past. But for Venner, an individual severed from tradition can have no identity at all. Venner's history of Europe focused on ancient city-states, medieval feudalism, and modern doctrines of political sovereignty. Pagan, Christian, and secular societies had different intellectual styles, as well as seemingly profound differences in religious faith and practice. But what they had in common, he maintained, was far more important and grounded the deep continuity of Western identity over time. It was a code of ideal conduct informed by an ethic of heroism. The West was, quote, founded on a heroic conception of life, he wrote, and sought to build its political order based on the hierarchy of merit and value. What Venner called an ethics of honor explained, in his opinion, a special aspect of its identity. Western culture is often noted for its individualism and its competitiveness, as well as its celebration of rebels, explorers, founders, and visionaries. Venner explained this dynamism by tracing its origins to an ethical code that accorded social status through competition. In its most traditional form, this competition wasn't motivated by a desire for wealth, resources, or even power. It was an aristocratic competition whose reward was honor, a contest for the pure prestige of being recognized as the best or most excellent. Unlike an ethics of dignity, this ethics of honor didn't distinguish between good and evil, in which transgression results in guilt. It distinguishes between superior and inferior, in which defeat results in shame. Venner drew inspiration from another seminal radical right thinker, the German historian Oswald Spengler. Spengler argued that the identity of European culture was explained by an inner drive that he called Faustian. As a Faustian culture, our culture places its highest value not on the survival of the group, but on the daring achievements of exceptional individuals. Spengler surveyed Western science, music, architecture, philosophy, and technology, and he concluded that in every domain, the arts and sciences of the West have been motivated by a heroic drive to overcome existing limits and to surpass previous achievements. Venner applied Spengler's vitalism to the history of our politics and culture. He asked, what is the great overarching moral story of our civilization? It's not the myth of our progressive march towards greater human equality, deepening concern for victims, and the secular saints who led the way. Rather, the story of our culture is the story of those extraordinary individuals who transformed human experience and changed the course of history. Venner called them higher men, describing them as those who dare to envision new human possibilities and to confront the most daunting human challenges. They're different from lower men in the most radical sense. Their achievements have been so transformative, so titanic, that they have to be seen as meaning makers or world builders. Venner meant that these so-called higher men had the strength to create meaning in history, to impose order on nature, to impress form on human experience, and to build civilization atop barbarism. As meaning makers, they brought the primordial potency of tradition into the actuality of human life. For Venner, then, we live in a world made possible not by universal ideals or by the systems that make cooperation possible. We live in patterns of meaning, patterns of order that are the legacies of Promethean people, the sole and true benefactors of humanity. At the heart of human life is therefore struggle. Venner wrote several books on the history of hunting and firearms, and he often described his vocation as a writer in martial terms. His interpretation of Western culture emphasized the essential and even creative role of human aggression. Struggle exists, firstly, in the primal conflict between the natural world and the human aspiration to raise itself above the life of mere survival. What we call culture is the precious and hard-won product of a life or death struggle to control nature and to transcend the ways that we are continually pulled down by its lower necessities. Conflict also exists between human beings, and not simply in the animal competition over goods and resources. It also exists in the human battle for honor and for prestige. Without struggle, without the fight for values and symbols and ideals that are higher than basic survival, for Venner, there is no culture and therefore no humanity. For Venner, then, conflict in its most human mode is not at all destructive. It is, as Heraclitus wrote, the father of all things. Here we reach another key idea of the radical right, which fears as a dystopia what other intellectual traditions have envisioned as a utopia. Imagine a world of peace, comfort, equality, and cooperation. Imagine a world in which conflict, suffering, and violence and inequality no longer brutalize human lives. For both liberalism and communism, interestingly, this world represents the hope of man and the goal of history, the final stage of our political development. For Venner, however, such a world is no dream, but a nightmare. It's a world so domesticated and so deformed as to be no longer human at all. Venner's fear wasn't that history would reach this post-human millennium. It was that the ideal itself had already crippled the Western soul. A vision of political life that seeks to increase pleasure and pain, to protect the weak and restrain the strong, to promote safety and diminish risk. For Venner, this is a recipe for decadence, not a charter for humanity. Under its influence, human beings will grow protective of their mediocrity and resentful to those aiming at higher things. Venner's argument wasn't that conflict or violence are intrinsic goods. It was that among the truths that Western people had forgotten was the fact that human beings must cultivate the strength to master themselves and to master their environment, and that the highest human excellences are attained only through suffering and risk and a taste for adventure. Venner's praise of human struggle drew from the writings of Ernst Jünger and Carl Schmitt, who both insisted on the cardinal importance of the martial virtues. Courage, loyalty, strength, patriotism. These are the most important virtues because they make all other virtues possible. Peace requires war. Friendship requires enemies. Loyalty requires exclusion. Love requires hate. Venner argued that a society that embraces the virtues of civility while denigrating the virtues of the warrior will become decadent and defenseless. I quote him, "We easily forget that the places of happiness and peace cannot last without the virile determination to protect them. The places of peace survive only through the virtues demanded by war." So, if Western culture was once heroic and self-affirming, why has it become weak and self-doubting? The question preoccupied the radical right, and I think more than anything else reveals its distinctive intellectual character. What the American writer Sam Francis called the Christian question asked whether it was the teachings of Christianity that was ultimately responsible for the crisis of Western identity. One of the most influential thinkers on the American dissident right, Francis argued that the deepest problems of American life are inseparable from the basic assumptions of liberal ideology. Take, for example, the notion that what human beings have in common is more important than what sets them apart. Or the idea that human beings possess equal rights regardless of their race, class, or gender. Or that the weak and infirm deserve special moral concern. These ideas are so widely accepted that few people bother to think about their foundations. But Francis argued that they're unintelligible apart from the moral legacy of Christianity. Francis was himself circumspect about whether Christianity is the true cause of Western decline. But Venner was not. Venner maintained that nihilism had been woven into the fabric of Western civilization by biblical religion. He described the disappearance of ancient paganism as a tragedy. And he argued that the real sacred scriptures of the West are the poems of Homer. He traced the source of Western nihilism to Roman Catholicism in general, and a Dominican friar in particular. Catholicism disenchanted nature and secularized everyday life. Its doctrines transformed a world full of gods and rituals and spirits into a secular sphere where salvation is sought in another world. But it was the rationalism of Aquinas, Venner charged, that paved the way to our current crisis. Aquinas' concern with a transcendent realm of abstract concepts had the unintended effect of suppressing human vitality and draining life of natural meaning. It fostered a culture that put intellect above passion, grace over nature, and concepts over reality. The tragedy of Thomism, Venner claimed, is that it uproots believers from the traditions of their ancestors and turns them instead toward the pursuit of abstract universal ideals. If Christian theology appears to no longer define the terms of our culture, Venner explained, it's only because our vocabulary has changed, not our basic outlook. Our new God terms are justice, equality, freedom, tolerance, omnipotent abstract nouns, having replaced an omnipotent spiritual being in the idiom of our piety. For the radical right, the sacral power of these words is evidence that our culture is charged with Christian assumptions. Christianity's legacy to our culture was not its creed or its churches, which can pass away with no loss of its power. It was its revolutionary transformation of morality, whose cunning power can take on religious or secular forms. Christianity gave rise to a new morality and a new humanism, setting the world on its present deviant course. Christianity inspired the discovery of human rights and dignity, an acute sensitivity to suffering and cruelty, a growing demand for equal recognition and inclusion, and an absolutely revolutionary belief that in victimhood, one can discover great power. In contemporary thought, Christianity is sometimes criticized for upholding social inequalities or restricting personal freedoms. But for Venner and the radical right, the problem with Christianity is that it's done precisely the opposite. The political consensus that shaped post-war life assumed that human beings are fundamentally rights-bearing individuals, and that the deepest threats to our flourishing come from infringements on our rights to choose. If that consensus is now being challenged, it's because its picture of human life has proven to be impoverished. Human beings are not, after all, defined through acts of individual choice and self-expression alone. We're creatures who find meaning in relationships that we haven't chosen, in responsibilities we can't relinquish, in traditions we're not free to change, and as characters and stories we haven't authored. And so we find ourselves relearning truths that liberalism was foolish to forget, and the radical right was eager to exploit. Our need to be a part of a distinct people, our need to protect and transmit an inheritance, our need to admire exceptional human beings and to celebrate inequalities of achievement, our need to achieve self-transcendence through self-sacrifice. These are desires of the human soul that liberalism can't satisfy, and that we shouldn't dare to ignore or impugn. Our challenge today is to rescue these aspirations from those who denigrate them, and to show how their proper development can ennoble and honor our humanity. Many of these concerns were shared by another French thinker who was shaped by the same experiences that radicalized a young Dominic Venner. In the early 1940s, the Jesuit theologian Henri de Lubac gave a series of talks on the collapse of the Third Republic. De Lubac was fiercely anti-fascist and had been forced into exile by the Nazi invasion. But he argued that the fall of his nation was due in part to the shallowness of its ruling ideology and the naivete of its elites. A society built around a narrow ideal of individual freedom and self-interest had invited social disaster. It had left many French isolated, uncertain, and yearning for richer and more demanding forms of community. For this social crisis, de Lubac argued, the Church bore significant responsibility. The seductive appeal of radical political religions could exist only where people's, quote, thirst for the absolute had been unmet by a church that had lost touch with the vitality of human life and the deep springs of its own tradition. Only by being enfolded into a vaster and deeper community, de Lubac wrote, a community whose essence is eternal, could human beings transcend the dangers of political ideology. But to elevate humanity to this higher community, de Lubac argued, Christianity needed to confront its most formidable criticism. It wasn't the critique that Christian belief is irrational or obsolete. It was the ancient charge, voiced aloud in modern Europe for the first time, that Christianity is hostile to human life, that it emasculates believers, profanes nature, slanders instincts, deforms imaginations, and spiritually disarms the cultures that it shapes. As de Lubac saw it, this accusation didn't express a mere denial of God's existence. It gave voice to something more radical and more troubling, an anti-theism that regarded the gospel as a calumny against life. To counter this charge, de Lubac argued the Church needed to rediscover from within her own forgotten traditions the life-affirming nature of Christian discipleship, a vision of humanity's supernatural destiny, whose demands make all earthly heroisms seem timid by comparison. And this, he warned, would be a matter of spiritual life or death in a coming secular age. Spiritual combat, as he called it, will be required of every believer who braves the challenges of living faithfully in an aggressively anti-Christian culture. I quote him, "Christian heroism will not consist of being delirious about the virtues of power. It will consist in bearing witness in the face of obvious lies and meretricious ideals to the fact that true power is made perfect in love." In his suicide note, Venner wrote that in choosing a voluntary death, he had resolved to uphold his ideals until the very end of life. He died in the hope that the demonstrated strength of his resolve could remind France of the forgotten truths of its patrimony. Venner imagined himself a lonely warrior defending lofty truths. But Venner's truths weren't lofty, and he wasn't alone. He's joined by all those who also imagined their identity as the self-originating source of meaning. Venner was blind, as many are today, to the great fact of Western culture. Its highest achievements testify to our astonishing ability to transcend our identities and to reflect the divine light of the universal through the creaturely limits of the particular. Venner's denial of transcendence left him doomed in imminence. He died in the fatal conviction that the purpose of existence is to move from life to death through unceasing struggle. But it's to take the opposite path through loving obedience. For de Lubac, Venner's ideals testified to a desire that he tragically misunderstood. The desire to overcome great challenges, to resist comforting illusions, the desire to transcend lower pleasures. This is far more than a key to understanding our culture. It's a desire fed at the very place of Venner's blasphemy for a God who leads us from death to life. Thank you.
Who's up first? Formulating. No. I'm not going to wait him out. I'm not going to flinch on this one. Yeah, there we go.
Could you illustrate your conclusion a little more? Because you illustrated your point very well throughout, but I just didn't understand the conclusion quite enough.
Sure, I appealed to a 20th century Jesuit theologian named Henri de Lubac, who was really confronted with a very similar set of circumstances that inspired and radicalized Dominic Venner, the author that I was talking about. De Lubac understood that what had befallen France in the 1940s was the result of a number of factors. It had to do with the corruption of the ruling ideology of the Third Republic. And it also had something to do with the fact that the church had kind of lost touch with the sources of its own tradition. And I imagine de Lubac judging, looking, and evaluating Dominic Venner, which of course he didn't live to do. What I imagine that de Lubac would say to Venner is that your desire was deeply and tragically misunderstood. You imagine human beings as motivated in part by a desire to overcome challenges, to resist lower pleasures, to find and to seek true greatness, and to identify the highest human excellences, and to order your life to an ideal or an image of excellence that can oftentimes require great sacrifices and great struggle. For de Lubac, and for me, Venner fatally misunderstood that. He misunderstood it because he thought that the purpose of life was to move from life to death through unceasing, unflagging struggle. He thought that the point of life was to die in complete control as the kind of author of one's own existence. For de Lubac, the aspiration, the human desire, properly understood, is one of the most ennobling and constitutive and important things for human nature. And in fact, it is a desire for a certain kind of heroism. But for de Lubac, that's an invitation to the life of Christian discipleship. Does that help a little bit?
That's a very solid question, is saying like, hey, I didn't quite follow that. Can you elaborate?
That's a great question.
Okay, so I read the article about that mentioned the Spagler.
Yeah.
So both Spagler and the men you mentioned today argue that Christianity is the cause of the Western decline. And can you reiterate many of the points? Which part of Christianity really caused the decline? I think you mentioned something like the care for the suffering, the promotion of like equality, all these things. Any other things? Thank you.
One of the kind of distinguishing intellectual hallmarks of the thinkers of the radical right involves their deep, profound suspicion of Christianity. And I think I kind of underlined some of those arguments tonight. That argument takes a number of different forms. For some thinkers in the intellectual tradition of the radical right, it's a political suspicion of Christianity. Christianity's revolutionary disruption of Western culture had everything to do with the fact that it fatally separated temporal and spiritual power. That when it introduced a deep political instability into all Western polities by the fact that it declared that the church and state are institutionally separate. For some radical right thinkers, this is the kind of schism that makes Western culture so unusual and so deviant when seen from the perspective of deep history. The fact that what we take to be sacred and what we take to be a source of political order aren't one and the same thing. Once you separate political and social power, human beings are reduced to having dual and conflicting allegiances. It simultaneously makes human beings too disobedient to earthly rulers and also too servile to God. That's the political suspicion. There's also a moral suspicion. The moral suspicion is that human being introduces this radical idea that human beings share a common nature, that they possess the ability to make judgments and evaluations that can affect their eternal destiny. And what Christianity essentially says to the ancient world is who and what you are, racially, geographically, nationally, all the things that are ascribed to you by your place and time and amongst people, aren't as fundamentally important as the decision that you make about your religious identity. That's a crude argument, but it helps gives you a sense of how the radical right thinkers could see Christianity as the kind of original source and inspiration between a kind of hyper-individualism, a hyper-subjectivity that works essentially to corrode and weaken all the bonds between human communities, between human ancestors, between human beings and political authorities. It essentially puts all those things under a kind of blanket of suspicion and questioning. It allows human beings to ask questions like, is this ruler, is this family, is this tradition, is this custom, is this really just, is this really right? Is it really as natural and decreed by the gods as we thought? It's a kind of radicalizing of human subjectivity and individualism that over time becomes intensified and accelerates and works to kind of dissolve the bonds that held together traditional societies.
Oh, hello. I agree with a lot of the criticisms that have been brought up of like what people see as maybe the fault of liberalism, and I don't agree with like the radical right conclusions to take from it. I guess, like I agree with your point. I guess the amount of people I know who have been reading like Storm of Steel by Junger or like Nietzsche, people getting into those sorts of things points to the fact that there is a serious problem. People aren't having their concerns answered. Like people who are on the right and looking for something deeper, they're getting suspicious of the lack of, I don't know, like they say vitality and stuff like that. I don't know what the sort of answer is to that like lack of meaning that people feel.
What do you think? I mean, you're a college student. I'm an academic, a generation ahead of you, and I'm fairly limited by the fact that in addressing this question about, and really it's a question of manhood and masculinity. I'm fatally limited by the fact that my answers always take the form of books and arguments and academic things, in which I'm not so sure that higher education can fix this problem. But can I ask you to reflect a little bit about yourself? I kind of suspected that you have some thoughts about your own, which I think might kind of enrich a conversation that has been kind of intellectual in nature.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very involved in local politics, stuff like that. So that's a source of meaning and community, I guess. That's something that I myself find meaning out of, and then obviously like religion would be another thing. But I don't feel like most people don't actually see that. They just kind of cast that aside as something that you can get meaning from local community, stuff like that.
Hi. So you spoke a bit about World War II to some degree in your talk. And so I honestly see that as one of the high points of the last 100 years for our society. And of course, in the wake of that, I think more or less we had a newfound respect for things like human rights, right, throughout the world. Or so we said. And I also think that our victory in the Second World War and the West's victory more or less was a reflection of our views and ideals, right? That we don't, build our society off of race, off of gender, off of faith even, but we, all come from very different backgrounds, yet share some certain ideals. And I think that one of the places where your subject goes wrong is that in a free society, or in a society that says it's free, such as the West, I think that there's something that forces us to be bonded, right? That set of ideals that keeps us free, that was first put down in 1776. So I think that for the new right-wing stuff that we're seeing now, where folks are like, I need, something to give my life to, right? That is so important, that we've lost who we are in the sense of that it's not based on race, gender, faith, or anything else. That is a set of ideals that we, the people who look different, who speak differently, value and uphold. And so for me, the threat is not that we have lost our way in that sense, but that we've lost our shared ideals from folks on the radical right, and I should say some on the radical left as well, but mainly the right. So, sorry for that long speech, folks, but I guess my question is, how would you respond to someone, who says these ideals are sort of out the window and yet still seem to be the one thing that bonds people together in a free society, and if you don't have that, then you're out of luck, I feel like. Excuse me for the long speech again, I'm sorry.
That's a great question, and in some sense it gets to the heart of the issue, because it asks a difficult question about where we go with this critique and what we can take from it. Take the liberal practices that many, I suspect most of us value. Equal treatment under the law, respect for human dignity, a willingness to let people speak when they give voice to ideals and arguments that we don't agree with, a willingness to settle our differences peacefully at the ballot box, abiding by the outcome of elections that we don't agree with. These are the practices of a liberal society. They are among some of the most important and valuable things that make a democratic life possible. The difficult question comes when we ask, where do these ideals and where do these practices come from? I'm of the opinion that they predate the rise of the philosophy that we call liberalism, and that they have their roots in a Western, biblical, both Jewish and Christian tradition, of which these ideals are, in some sense, the kind of social, civic, and political flowering. I'm highly skeptical, more than skeptical. I'm very not at all persuaded by the idea that these liberal practices and ideals are self-supporting, that they can be sustained in a culture or a politics in which their moral and religious foundations have been forgotten or denigrated. So let me take apart your question in this way. I'm deeply supportive of, strongly defender of, the practices, the traditions, the customs that we customarily call a liberal society. I'm not nearly so confident in the intellectual arguments that support it in what we call liberal political theory or liberal philosophy. Sometimes I think that actually the intellectual arguments in favor of liberalism are sometimes some of the deepest threats to the practices and the ideals of liberalism. Not only that, sometimes I think that the best friend, the deepest friend of the liberal society and the practices that we all value actually come from traditions that are outside of liberalism. The traditions of biblical faith especially. So I agree with you about the importance of defending and valuing and passing on the civic practices of a liberal democracy. But I think to be true friends of that tradition, we have to see that its roots are far deeper than we are customarily allowed to, acknowledge.
So I was wondering, through either your own or Venner's perspective, how one would analyze what's going on in, I want to say Europe, but maybe more specifically France, Ireland, and the UK. I'll go out on a limb and say that there's been a serious degradation of Western values, and I was wondering, through either your own or Venner's perspective, what either of you would say is going on, and or maybe the next step in maybe reversing some of the damage that's been done.
Yeah, here I don't have to speculate because Venner wrote extensively on this in the last years of his life. He died 10 years ago, 2013, before the kind of set of political controversies and challenges associated with the migrant crisis that has so defined the last decade of politics in Europe. But on immigration into Europe, he was despairing. In fact, most of his suicide note it communicates his despair about the kind of demographic changes, not only in France, but in Europe generally. Had Dominic Venner lived to see the last 10 years of our politics, I think he would not have been surprised. I think the earlier question asked about the kind of seductive appeal of arguments, not only from Venner, but those like him, and no doubt some of the kind of intuitive appeal of people like Venner and authors like him come from the fact that they, at some level, seem to have anticipated contemporary politics with a little bit of disturbing prescience. Yeah, yeah. Venner invited the people who read his books to imagine themselves as world builders and meaning makers, people who could impose order on chaos and civilization on barbarism, impose form on disorder. I would recommend that you don't take that path. This is, to me, a fantastic, borderline demonic myth that I think harms human souls in its kind of seductive appeal. My answer to you is to, this is a difficult question. Is to find a way of life in which the goal that you set for yourself and the virtues that you acquire to get there will allow you to become the kind of person that you can attain the true end of your life. Figuring that out is the most difficult and decisive thing in your life, but in some sense it's the only thing also. Your life has the character of a quest in which you, over the course of your life, hopefully become the kind of person who's capable of making that journey. A longer answer. Hopefully you'll come to dinner, we can sit by each other and talk about that more.
I feel like we might have to up your honorarium after that question. You didn't know.
I was looking for you to come bail me out, but...
Yeah. I'm going to add one-liner. It's a beautiful
Great, thank
answer.
you.
I'm going to add a one-line. And look for partners and friends
Thank you. Yeah.
along the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look for partners and friends. Okay, now I hate to ask this question because, of course, I'm an academic too, and I'm about to ask a very conceptual question, but I'll try to put it practically. Just briefly, the name of Friedrich Nietzsche was mentioned. I was a little bit surprised that he didn't figure anywhere in this genealogy, and maybe that's having to do with the specifics of Dominic Venner, but here's the question that I'll put to you. Should we imagine that we could read Nietzsche now as a way of understanding the rise of the radical right today?
Nietzsche is a prophet. Nietzsche understands the itinerary of modernity and modern thought as well, if not better than any other modern philosopher. Nietzsche, in some sense, not in every respect, understands the revolutionary and subversive nature of Christianity. For him, Christianity is the kind of original wound at the heart of Western culture. It is the bleeding, separating conscience of a culture that can't give form and expression to itself. Nietzsche's understanding of Christianity wasn't perfect. It reflected his own Lutheran background. But Nietzsche understood that modern culture, modern values remained completely charged with Christian assumptions. Your question, can you remind me what your question was specific so I can make sure to respond to it? Yeah. Nietzsche said that, I am the philosopher of the future. He said that I'm the only philosopher who has really seen through to the destination of where Western culture is going. I didn't mention Nietzsche in the paper, didn't mention Nietzsche in the book, because in some sense Nietzsche inhabits every page and every sentence of the book. A secondary reason was that Nietzsche, of course, didn't live through the 20th century, nor did he live to see the kind of emergence of what I called the post-war consensus. And for that reason, he's just working through a different historical context. I hope and I trust that Nietzsche is part of the curriculum of Western civilization, and I encourage people to read Nietzsche soberly and thoughtfully and closely, as Christians especially, because I think that Nietzsche renders a real service to people who can see the theology of Nietzsche and how he wants us to understand the place of Christianity.
A warm round of applause for Matthew Rose. Thank you. We'll see you all down the hall.
Thanks, everybody.